Hey everyone, we're continuing our full set review of Revelations, and we are still on the multi-faction cards, and today we're going to be looking at the cards that touch the Genesis faction but do not include Warpath in their faction identity, and the reason for that is we've actually already covered the Warpath multi-faction cards in different video. And as a reminder, we're going to be discussing how spicy I think the cards are, so how excited I am about those cards subjectively, regardless of how powerful those cards are, and I'm of course very curious to hear other people's opinions on those cards. So we're going to jump right into it and start with Bloodcore Mecha, which I feel like is a card that is attempting to support an existing deck, which is the Tinker deck. Reason I feel that way is Bloodcore Mecha feels like some sort of amalgamation of Aether Acolyte and Demon of Dark Bargains, which are both cards that you're likely to play in the Tinker deck, and this is kind of in between both of them. For that reason, I'm going to give this card a 3 spice because I, of course, would like to try it out in the Tinker deck and see how this card performs. But frankly, I don't see myself building a new deck around the card so much as just inserting it into an existing deck to see if it does in fact fit there. Next, we have Illegal Magitech, and this card deserves a little bit of extra discussion here. So I think the first thing we should say is that because the cost and the faction identity are identical to research and the two cards have very similar functions, it's very difficult not to compare the two cards. So research, you pay 3 and you're guaranteed to draw 2. With Illegal Magitech, you pay 3 and you are going to draw somewhere between 0 and 3 cards, and the remainder of the cards will go to your graveyard, which notably going to your graveyard is not necessarily a bad thing because we have some cards, including ones that we'll talk about in this video, that have recall or other effects that do things from the graveyard. So graveyard isn't necessarily a total loss here, but I think it's fair to say that for this card to be distinctly worth including in your deck over research, you need to include an extremely high density of cards that fit Illegal Magitech's requirements, which are 5 or less cost abilities and artifacts. So you could build a new deck around Illegal Magitech's requirement to try to really take advantage of it and try to get closer to that 3 out of 3 end of the spectrum. However, it's worth noting that 2/3 of your deck at least has to be 5 cost or less abilities or artifacts for the card to break even with research. For it to be better than research, greater than 2/3 of your deck has to fit this requirement. And that's a very steep requirement. For that reason, I think I'm going to give this a 2 spice. I will absolutely try the card at some point and try to really lean into that restriction around the card, but it's very, very easy to just play research instead, and you aren't really losing much in terms of potency with the number of cards you draw, while when you're using research, you free up your deck building requirements entirely. You don't have to put any restrictions on yourself to make the card work. So 2 spice. Next, we have Flamedawn and Genesis, Droppod Battalion. And I'm going to give this card 4 spice. I think this card is extremely aggressive, one of the most aggressive cards we have. And it's in a combination of factions that historically have played very aggressively together. So I'm excited to see the return of Genesis plus Flamedawn aggro. Not that it's necessarily gone anywhere, but I haven't seen it as much, and this is going to bring some resurgence of that strategy with some new spice to it. Okay, next, Talich Accords, and we have talked about this already. I think we've actually talked about Droppod Battalion as well, but anyways, Talich Accords is a 5 spice card for me because this does not fit into any existing deck, and that when this card becomes available, it's going to be its own deck that you really have to think about. How are you going to capitalize on that big AoE recurring buff? And I'm curious to see what people come up with, and I'm definitely going to give it a shot myself. Okay, now we have Genesis plus Descendants of the Dragon, and we starting with Analyze the Threat. This card I'm going to give 3 spice. It is just a solid card, but I don't expect is going to change how you play the game, and I don't think you're going to really build a deck around it. That this falls into our category of potato cards, where it is maybe a crucial structural piece for a deck, but isn't really the reason you're excited to play the deck. So, totally solid card, just not one that is getting me jumping out of my seat. And the other Genesis plus Descendants of the Dragons card is Philosophic Android. And I am going to give this card 4 spice, because this is a card that you do build a deck around, and is a very cool deck, I would say. That it is a deck that encourages you to include a high density of abilities that target characters you control, because you get that barrier 1 payoff. And that barrier 1 could be very, very effective. I think it's worth noting here that I believe that you can stack up barrier multiple times. Don't quote me on that, but barrier is a very strong effect to have, and it doubles as both just being useful on its own and also being able to allow you to take advantage of those abilities that target characters while protecting those characters at the same time. So a card like Upgrade suddenly becomes significantly better. So, cool card. All right. Next, we have Crystalline Replication. This card is a 5 spice card for me for a number of reasons. One, Exiles plus Genesis is just something we haven't really gotten to see very much of at all. And then also, this card has so many applications, so much flexibility. You can lean into maybe duplicating a specific character, or you can just use this as a value piece to recur a character that is just overall very solid, and that extra +5/+5 is very nice. And I'll throw out there, we just talked about Philosophic Android. You could use those 2 cards together. That this Crystalline Replication is a targeted effect. So, very cool card, 5 spice for me. Okay. Next, we have Logic Virus, which I think this is probably a 2 spice card for me. That it's very flashy, has a very big effect, but the extraordinarily high upfront cost is very cumbersome. That although the ability to play the card from your graveyard for the cost of 7 is quite notable, you really kind of need a way to get this card into your graveyard for it to be spicy. And I know there's lots of ways you can do that, especially with the Sleepers faction, but I'm going to put that deck building creative burden on somebody else in the community. And when somebody else shows me how to properly use this card, then I will imitate. But it's not a card that I'm personally going to be building a deck around until I see it in action. And then finally, we have our Genesis plus Overseers cards, starting with Micro Rift Research. And I'm going to give this card 4 spice. It's just, it's got a lot of different uses. It can target 2 characters and remove them for 1 turn, which can be used to double up on some of your deploy effects, or to take away 2 attackers or 2 blockers from your opponent. It's preemptive, which is really significant because you can potentially use it to disrupt your opponent's plan when you don't have priority. And then it's also got recall for 6. I think I would be playing this card even if it didn't have recall for 6. So overall, just a really, really potent card and flexible too. And it's worth mentioning, leading into our next card here, that you're probably going to play these 2 together. D.O.G, or D.O.G, and this is a 5 spice card for me. That it is a card that very clearly wants you to build a deck around it, that you can bounce D.O.G in and out of play to get it bigger and bigger and dip further into its bonus effects. So I think this card's really cool. I plan on building this deck on day one. And I think it's fair to mention here that D.O.G's fail case is still pretty solid, that its bare minimum is going to be a 1-cost 4/5, which is not bad at all. So very much a card that you can have fun with, even if it's not the central piece of your deck. And that wraps up everything for our Genesis multi-faction cards, and I will see you soon with some undetermined number of remaining multi-faction cards.